I'm Pedram Khosrownejad, the curator of Persian Arts at the Powerhouse Museum. On behalf of our team, I welcome all of you to our second talk of Iran Zamin talk series. As you may know, this series happened in the occasion of Iran Zamin exhibition that will continue until August 8th. Every month we have 2 talks, and still we have 4 more talks. And very good news that is we didn't add it online. On July 30th, we have an international symposium. So it's open to everyone, and it's about the definition of Persian or Iranian arts and the role of curatorial for running exhibition on this topic with the participation of international and top-rate keynote speakers from Aga Khan Museum and University of Michigan, the head of art history, including our guest speaker today, Dr. Mahroo Moosavi. The talk series that we have in the occasion of Iran Zamin is just to open a little bit for the first time at the Powerhouse and probably in Australia, what we call Persian art, what we call Iranian art. Are there differences between these two or are the same? The Persian arts and crafts of Islamic periods of Iran, shall we call them Islamic art? Shall we call them Persian Islamic art? So we try to clarify the definition, and this is why we are honored to have top-rate scholars of Sydney universities and Australian-based colleagues, and also international keynote speakers. And we hope by the end of exhibition, which is August 8th, altogether we think differently. I don't say change what we have today as a definition of Persian arts and crafts, but maybe in 21st century we need another way to present Persian arts and crafts, especially in the context of museum studies and exhibitions. Our speaker today, Dr. Mahroo Moosavi, is a lecturer in architectural history, theory, and design at the University of Sydney. But in the same time, she's holding 2 very important fellowships with the University of Oxford. First, she's Bahari Fellow in the Persian Arts of the Book at this university, Oxford, and also Oliver Smith Lecturer at Balliol College in Oxford University. Her research is concerned with the intertext of architecture and poetry, prose, with a particular focus on the early modern Safavid Iran, through an interdisciplinary study of architectural history, literature, and post-structuralist philosophy. Her current project analyzes the interpretations of form and structure of rhetorical devices in the chancellery writings of 16th and 17th century Iran to identify possible resonances within the artistic and urban system of the new city of Isfahan. Please join me to welcome Dr. Mahroo Moosavi to the podium.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Khosrownejad, for the introduction. It's my great honor to be here as a speaker of the academic talks of the Iran Zamin exhibition. I should thank Professor Khosrownejad for inviting me, and I should thank you all for attending the talk. So, today, I will talk about new ways through which we can look at Islamic art and Islamic art history. By going through some sources and cases, I will argue that the specific nature of Islamic art, and particularly Persian art, embeds different methods of production and reception of art, which is different to the Western art history methodology. And by the end, I will suggest that by understanding these different methods of production and reception of Islamic and Persian art, we might be able to come up with new ideas in terms of the selection and curation of Islamic art and Persian art exhibitions and museums. In the museums, we idolize objects. Historical objects turn into idols when they are valued for the fact that they are being declared historical or heritage. But what is missed in this process is that we no longer maintain a dynamic relationship with the object. The essence of this relationship is no longer a conversation or a dialogue with the object. It would be appropriate here to refer to the spatial architectural phenomenon in which the visitors of historic buildings leave traces of themselves, usually in the form of transcripts engraved onto the walls of the building. The term graffiti might be the closest concept to describe this phenomenon of wall writing, which is called yadegari in Persian, literally meaning relic or remembrance, which is due to the lack of strict protecting systems in the heritage sites. However, it sheds light on important mechanisms of the dynamics of the relationship between the user and the art. A 12th century Seljuk plaster wall inscribed with the rough, childish scratches by two lovers who attempted to eternalize their love is dramatically different to a well-preserved object in a museum, kept in a carefully manufactured display box with controlled light and color. More than anything else, this harsh opposition draws our attention to the very different nature of architecture from the other branches of art. Architecture is almost the only type of artistic production that cannot be fully and with its entirety extracted from its original geographic context and is meant to remain in tight connection with its original user or visitor. The reconstruction of iconic buildings or so-called architectural styles as national pavilions has been common in the history of Islamic art exhibitions, such as the Persian pavilion that Arthur Pope designed for the 1926 International Exposition in Philadelphia, and it was intended to mimic a Safavid mosque from the front. Also, the large wooden model of the Shah Mosque in the 1931 Persian Arts London exhibition. Recreating the original architectural contexts, such as Met's Syrian room, which was a virtually complete room from an 18th century Damascus house, was another technique in this regard. Also, the recreation of a Maghrebi Andalusian-style courtyard in Met's galleries for the art of the Arab lands has been another common technique. Also, fragments and furniture of architecture, such as the Minbar of Sultan Qaitbay of the Mamluks, have happened to be transferred to exhibits and museums. However, the extraction and decontextualization of the entirety of an original building is almost an impossible action and a very rare phenomenon, which means a building is meant to stay in its original site and continue to act in its original manner with its user or visitor. This leads us to the next question, which is, how can we rethink the isolated, decontextualized manners by which art, and particularly Islamic art, is exhibited in the museums? What are the alternate paradigms through which we can display Islamic art? It might be possible to refer to the manners by which the users of space interact with the space and architecture to understand what may be actually missing from their reconstructed relationship with other artistic media preserved in the intermediary museums. This missing aspect is what I would like to call encounter. It is, however, important to differentiate between this type of encounter and the phenomenological encounter or experience. While phenomenological experience is based on the mainly biologic senses, the complexities of encounter extends towards the agency of intellect, emotion, and the ways of inhabiting the world by the Muslim patron, artist, and the user. Here, I would like to refer to the type of relationship that religio-political fanaticism draws with the material received from the historical past. Unlike us, fanatics, either belonging to political dynasties or ideological extremism, they do not differentiate between architectural heritage or museum objects. They are committed to destroy both. The most recent example in the Islamic lands is the simultaneous destruction of architectural sites, such as Islamic shrines, and the objects in the museums, such as the Mosul Museum by the ISIS forces in Syria and Iraq. While the museological perspective preserves historical objects through defining boundaries around them, fanatics do not hesitate to invade a museum space, as they similarly do with an architectural or archaeological site. The applicability of the same type of violence towards both so-called high art and minor arts, the taxonomic system inherited from Western art history, sheds light on the futility and fake nature of these categoric systems, imposed by the modern positivist approach that classifies Islamic art into high arts such as architecture and painting, and minor arts such as pottery, metalwork, textile, and carpet, or what may be called applied arts. It's not only the very separation of architecture and painting from the applied arts that is problematic. Rather, and more importantly, the problem lies in the way we treat different branches of art in different manners. While horrific in nature, extremists show us a new, unbiased way of looking at Islamic art history. While the classification of Islamic art is rooted in many ways in the Western art historical methodology, it also, and in parallel, inherits in big parts the thinking traditions of Islamicists and Iranologists such as Arthur Pope. The pure formalistic approach that Pope and many other early scholars of Islamic art promoted, although now outdated, still has an effect on the study of Islamic art. This leads us to the next topic in this paper, through which I will argue that Persian art, by its specific nature, may be used as a tool to diagnose the problematic nature of the contemporary notions of Islamic art history and Islamic art exhibitions specifically. I would like to go back to the notion of encounter with historical objects. The type of encounter I'm focusing on here is between a local person and a historical building or site. Here, there is less physical mediation or psychic cultural barrier between the person and the object. I may call this an unmediated historical engagement. In this type of encounter, the user of the space and generations before have developed a meaningful relationship with the space and architecture. In this relationship, the dynamics of the encounter between the user and the object extends towards the collective socio-cultural and historical memories and the individual's cognitive, emotive system, interconnected with the folklore and literary traditions. Islamic art, by its specific nature, is an intensely textual art. Not only architecture, but also ceramics, pottery, metalwork, textile, carpet, and many other Islamic artistic media are accompanied by extensive textual components which would draw a relationship with the cognitive and emotional systems of the user or the local observer. The user of a jar or a textile that is inscribed with text would simultaneously have a biologic sensory experience of the applied object and an intellectual, cognitive, and emotional encounter with the object through reading the text. I refer to this 19th century Sufi comb exhibited in the Iran Zamin exhibition for a better clarification of this point. This handcrafted comb was used as an accessory prior to the act of prayer and is inscribed on both sides with the names of the Prophet Muhammad and his family. The comb is the opening object of the spirituality and devotion section, which focuses on religious and mystical practices of the Iranian society. It, however, is spatially placed by the curator at the intersection of the two sections of purification and cleansing and spirituality and devotion, questioning the Western predetermined boundaries between the physical and metaphysical. While the whole notion of Islamic art is in tight connection with inscribed texts, Persian arts is specifically distinct as it's heavily infused by poetry, especially from the Timurid period in the 15th century onwards. From the late medieval and early modern period, a fundamental and extensive part of the understanding of and the drawing connections with a building or an object in Persianate societies is based on the textual components that accompany with and inject thematic meanings to an object. Marginalizing these textual components equals missing a substantial part of the encounter with an object, which will be automatically lead to a mainly formalistic and positivist approach towards the Islamic art, or in some cases, it will lead to coining Orientalist titles to Islamic art, such as decorative arts, or the generalized title of innate decorators that Pope gave to Iranians in his ideas about the nature of Persian art that led to the 1931 Persian Arts exhibition in London. If the Islamic art museums and exhibitions are intended to enable forms of understanding of Islamic art, something that the emerged field of Islamic art history is based on, then, parallel to all other factors, they should also put a careful focus on the multiplicity of the layers of encounter between the human and the object. Instead of establishing a hierarchy of worth and value systems by elegantly designed museums with their hegemonic order representing high culture in which museums tell stories of themselves, rather, they should aim for telling the stories of the objects and the users of the objects. And this is a topic that is discussed in detail by Wendy Shaw in the context of Islamic art history. The museums and exhibitions must invite people to contemplate on the physical and metaphysical intricacies of life through the intellectual and emotional encounter with the art. Discussed by Oleg Grabar in detail, the strategies of many Islamic art museums is still based on the idea that only masterpieces should be displayed in museums and exhibitions, or they should at least be at the forefront. Inherited from the late 19th, early 20th century approach of the French collectors of Oriental objects and infused with a commercial and retail perspective towards objects, this way of looking at Islamic art needs a serious reconsideration. The use of adjectives such as exquisite, elegant, splendid to refer to Islamic art objects surprisingly still exists in the labeling systems of objects in museums, and is a process through which a generalized singular meaning is entitled to an object. This very act of naming kills the intricacies of the object. Without triggering in-depth thoughts, these naming systems reduce an object to a plain phenomenon with no specificities and intricacies. The discussion about the object is closed in the observer's mind the moment it's opened, rather than a passive thing that is merely beautiful and an object of scientific or paleographic art historical detective act. An object can also be considered an active agent of a complex web of psychic societal practices. The 1989 exhibition Timur and the Princely Vision, Persian Art and Culture in the 15th Century, organized by the Sackler Gallery and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, although is still amongst the most scholarly approached Islamic art exhibitions, were methodologically and in scope limited to the idea of art as a means of currying the favor of the culturally advanced among their subjects. A thematicization that would reduce art to manifestations of power and politico-societal matters with no deep consideration of art as the agency of ascertaining the intellect, emotions, and precisely the real life of patrons, artists, and users. Going earlier in time, together with 1931 International Exhibition of Persian Art in London, one determining idea in the Islamic art exhibition practices in the 20th century was Henri Saladin's Manuel d'Art Musulman of 1907, in which he segregated materials through their presumed artistic value. Calligraphy was absent in Saladin's list, highlighting a big gap between Islamic aesthetics that is in big part based on the written form and the Orientalist perspective that looks at text as a mainly paleographic tool. Also, although modified in many ways, contemporary Islamic art museums and exhibitions are still influenced to some extent by the Munich 1910 Islamic art exhibition, in which curators organized works by medium, placing the objects well apart from each other in order for the observer to be able to contemplate them. The secluded objects in the Munich exhibition and the missing category of calligraphy from Saladin's list were both the result of neglecting the intertextual nature of the Islamic art, in which art is depicted and perceived through a complex woven system of thought and experience by the Muslim patron, artist, and user. In this part of the paper, and to clarify what I mean by this type of encounter with art, I will refer to the art of calligraphy, especially Persian calligraphy in Nasta'liq script. Nasta'liq style of calligraphy is a Persian script developed primarily at the Timurid and Uzbek atelier and workshops in Herat and Bukhara in the 14th and 15th centuries. A Nasta'liq disciple was supposed to qualify themselves spiritually for being a calligrapher. I'm particularly referring to Adab al-Mashq, manners of practice, an autograph written by the Persian calligrapher Baba Shah Isfahani. Adab al-Mashq is a late 16th, early 17th century Safavid Persian treatise on the Nastaliq style of calligraphy that contains a full description of the techniques and teaching methods of the calligrapher's art. Here, I will review some parts of the treatise. Baba Shah, in one section, refers to another master calligrapher, Sultan Ali Mashhadi, and in describing his handwriting says, his alefs, alef is a letter in Persian script, his alefs were like the tall sapling figures that give peace to the soul, and the eyes of his sad, sad is another letter, and the eyes of his sad was like the eye of youthful sweethearts. His dal and lam are two other letters of Persian script. His dal and lam were like the tresses of heart-ravishing beloveds, and the circles of the nun is another letter, the circles of the nun were like the eyebrows of devastating beauties. Every one of his dots was like the pupil of the dark-eyed, and every one of his strokes was like the water of life in the darkness of running ink. While these metaphoric descriptions of calligraphic letter seem formalistic, on another layer, they connect the form of calligraphy to the very emotions of the artist. The letters in this new perspective depart from forms and start to act as elements that are woven with the fabric of emotions and feelings of the artist. Drawing parallels between the form of the letter Aleph and the beloved's figure is a mechanism through which one signification system turns into another. So if you can see here, we have the letter Sad that I'm pointing to, which is likened to the eye of youthful sweethearts. The letter Aleph is likened to the tall figures that give peace to the soul. Nun is like the eyebrows of beauties. Lam and dal are like tresses or the curvy hair of the beloved. Dots is like the dark eyes of the beloved. And then these types of strokes that happen a lot in Nastaliq calligraphy, these stretched forms, is likened to the water of life in the darkness of running ink. In other words, the simple shape of Aleph, instead of simply referring to the pronounced sound of ah, refers to a whole new system of inhabiting the world by the manner of love. There are numerous couplets in the history of Persian poetry that use such a system. This has even entered the colloquial language of the Iranian people. For example, if someone says, "The aleph of my figure has turned into a dal," it implies that their youthfulness has passed or they have experienced a severe difficulty. So again, here you can see letter aleph, which is tall and unbowed. It's like a young, joyful, fresh person. And then here, letter dal, which is somehow bow-backed and is associated with the ideas of age, suffering. You can see that in this discourse of scripture and calligraphy, a letter, a word, or a sentence is not only a visual and formal element. Rather, It operates in several invisible realms and systems of signification. The letters in the hands of the master calligrapher are like flexible molds that exhibit the inner layers of intellect and emotions and also affect the reader's intellectual and emotional systems. The ultimate degree of this interplay happens when the form and content of calligraphy cooperate to manipulate the reader's emotive cognitive system. Again, I refer to Baba Shah's Adab al-Mashq here. Baba Shah describes the stylistic and psychologic basis of calligraphy, first making a distinction between the parts that are acquired and those that are not. The acquired parts may be gained by persistence and maturity. Of the 12 acquired parts of script, the first 9 have to do with technical style. The 10th part, principles, usul, is based on a skillful control of the previously mentioned 9 stylistic parts. The 11th part, purity, safa, is primarily a quality of the heart. Purity is that condition which makes a mystic deeply content despite any difficulties. It is the degree of reza in the ideology of Islam. A razi person is someone who has reached the level of mystical contentment and satisfaction. Baba Shah again refers to Sultan Ali in saying that purity of writing is from purity of heart. Through this quality, there is complete possession of the art of writing. In other words, Baba Shah believes that if a calligrapher is mastered in the technical usul and spiritual safa, this is a desired state of calligraphy. The effect, or what is called asar, comes from this amalgamation of form and meaning. Here I'm focusing on this notion of effect or asar, for which Baba Shah alternatively uses the word mazze, which means taste. Persian poetry, especially in the Iraqi and consequently Isfahani style from the 12th to the 18th century, puts a significant focus on this asar or effect or mazze, taste. I specifically refer to 2 couplets by Hafiz, the well-known 14th century Persian poet, in which he says, شاهدان نیست که مویی و میانی دارد بنده طلعت آن باش که آنی دارد. One who has immaculate hair and figure is not necessarily beauteous. Rather, be prepossessed by the splendor of the one who has that elaborate moment. In this couplet, I have translated the term on as elaborate moment. On, in folk culture, is a mysterious type of beauty that is perceived but is not describable. In another poem, Hafiz indirectly refers to on and explains it as a highly elaborate, hidden, mysterious thing which causes love. لطیفه است نهانی که عشق از او خیزد که نام آن نه لب لعل و خط زنگاری است. جمال شخص نه چشم است و زلف و عارض و خال. هزار نکته در این کار و بار دلداری است. Love is caused by a hidden, mysterious, elaborate thing that is neither red garnet-like lips nor freshly grown facial hair. One's beauty does not come from eyes and hair and face and beauty mark. Thousands of points are engaged when love strikes. This mysterious, highly elaborate, hidden thing that causes love is very similar to the asar, effect, or mazze, taste, that Baba Shah refers to. It's the quality that is perceived but is not describable. Therefore, it's far from form and is more related to the realm of content. The 13th century Persian poet Molavi, who is known in the Western culture as Rumi, uses on also in the meaning of a latife, or a fine quality which is the most inner and essential quality of the very existence of a human. حق آن آنی که این و آن از اوست، مغزها نسبت بدو باشد چو پوست. In this couplet, Moulavi refers to the idea that on or that fine quality is placed in such a deep inner place that is deeper than the deepest and all of the cores and centers. Baba Shah too refers to the human face, explaining that no matter how proportionate a face is, if it lacks that inner quality, it's not attractive. This late medieval, early modern Islamic literary and artistic approach towards beauty is significantly different to the Western Renaissance view towards proportionate beauty and the emerged notions of optics, perspective, picturesque, and the modern positivist centrality of the visionary beauty. A Muslim artist is in possession of art through the purity of art, which is an inner rather than outer quality. Therefore, although an art object might be formally a masterpiece, it might not be mu'assir, effective, or might not include mazze, be tasteful. This artistic perspective, which is intensely informed by the Islamic Sufi teachings, once again reminds us that we cannot draw lines between Islamic art as part of cultural production and Islamic art as religious practice. This separation was reinforced in Islamic art exhibition practices after the 11th of September and the 7th of July terrorist attacks, and was initially meant to showcase an exoticized, beautiful face of the lands of Islam through introducing their artistic masterpieces as cultural and, in some cases, secular productions, rather than the product of Islamic thought. However, by reducing the complexities of this art into a secular cultural production, it reduces an object into a flat site of visionary beauty, leading to an automatic erasure of the triggering of deeper thoughts in the observers of the art. Looking at an object as a point in which the usul, principles, and the safa, purity, integrate in order for the emergence of asar or effect, sets new criteria for the selection of Islamic art objects for museums and exhibitions. In this new scenario, the curation of the objects would destabilize the organization of space and the arrangement of objects informed by the Western art history methodology. While the modern positivist view, rooted in the Enlightenment period, erases the art's aura, the late medieval, early modern Islamic artistic practices put a high value on the ambiguity of art and the specific relationship between the art and the user or the observer of art. Similarities between the way the art of calligraphy is treated in Baba Shah's treatise and the way a beloved is described in Persian poetry leads us to the idea that an art object in the Islamic culture is an object of love. Both a piece of nastaliq calligraphic text and the face of a beloved must comply with the criteria of asar, effect, and mazze, taste, which means that conducting a meaningful relationship with art embeds a form of love. It's crucially important to note that this love relationship between the observer and the observed object is not a worshipper-worshipped relationship. Rather, it may conceptually perpetuate the long tradition of the intimate relationship between a Muslim and the Prophet Muhammad. Unlike Christianity, which incorporates the character of Christ into a systematic definition of divinity, Muhammad in the ideology of Islam is considered a human being rooted in earthly, tangible discourses. Therefore, the emerged love between a Muslim and the Prophet Muhammad is not in the category of divine love. The perennial discussion of iconoclasm and the common misunderstanding of the notion of figural depiction in Islam may connect well to this argument. While figural depiction of Muhammad is not banned in Islam, and there is extensive body of literature by contemporary scholars of Islamic art in this regard, and I specifically refer to the work done by Pedram Khosrownejad, the instances mainly from the 16th century onwards, in which the face of the Prophet is not depicted or is hidden, I would argue, is due to the very specific definition of love in the Islamo-mystic traditions of late medieval and early modern period. The face and the aesthetic dimensions of the face in this ontological system is not the central aspect in the generation of love, and consequently, it disappears or loses its significance in the sake of the main element in the creation of effect or asar and love, which is the purity, safa, the on and the inner quality of Islam mediated by the Prophet. The relationship, the encounter between a Muslim and the Prophet or a Muslim citizen and their environment is a complex relationship in which one has the possibility of interpretation of another person or object, rather than reduce it to facial and factual things. For a better clarification, I refer to three fundamental sources in Shia Islam. First, to Usul Kafi by Yaqub Kulaini, written in the 10th century. Kulaini quotes from Haris ibn Zaid, the Prophet's companion, who describes his state of being and the way he perceives the world. Haris says, كَأَنِّي أَنظُرُ إِلَى أَهْلَ الْجَنَّةِ, which means it is like I see the residents of the heaven. Although the verb andur, I see, is used here, by the application of ka'anni, it is like, it loses its meaning. Therefore, the whole notion of seeing the heavens becomes an action associated with the inner cognitive and emotional organs of the observer. The second example is from Bahar al-Anwar by Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, the 17th century Safavid theologian. Majlisi brings a hadith in which the Prophet defines ihsan, goodness, as to worship Allah as if you see Him. Al-ihsanu an ta'budullah ka'annaka tarah. In another example from Nahjul Balagha, the collection of sayings and writings of Imam Ali, the first Imam of Shia, Ali quotes from the Prophet who says to Ali, "You hear what I hear, and you see what I see. Innaka tasma'u ma asma' wa tara ma ara." The hearing and seeing in this sentence is indeed not referring to the biological ears and eyes, but to the inner ears and eyes, or what is called cheshme dil in Persian. When the agent of the eye of the heart is engaged in the act of love, love turns into a complex interpretive system that is highly selective in determining what to regard and what to disregard in the beloved or in the object of love. Going back to the discussion of museums and exhibitions, selecting and curating objects for Islamic art museums and exhibitions according to the possibility of shedding light on the discourse of love between the patron, artist, user, and the art object, also the possibility of the emergence of a new form of relationship between the museum goer and the art object, might be a new curatorial methodology through which Islamic art museums could operate. In the last part of the paper, I would like to refer to the famous 16th century Safavid Ardabil carpet, housed and on display in the Jamil Gallery at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. This 10.5 by 5.3 meter carpet, along with its twin carpet housed in Los Angeles County Museum of Art, have long been the topic of art historical scholarly debate. It is significant for its outstanding quality of design and weaving, for the precise date it carries, also for how it reached its current destination. The carpet was most probably used in a shrine, either the shrine of Shah Safi in Ardabil or the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad. While the intricacies of the design and the historical value of the carpet are indeed important and have been extensively focused upon, I would like to draw your attention to the carpet's inscription in an ivory cartouche near the end of the field. The inscription includes in the Nastaliq script a couplet by Hafiz, the name of the patron or designer, and a date. The couplet reads as جز آستان تو هم در جهان پناهی نیست سر مرا به جز این در حواله‌گاهی نیست, which means I have no refuge but you. I have no returning point but you. This is followed by the term عمل بنده درگاه مقصود کاشانی سنه 946, which means done by the slave of the divine place مقصود کاشانی at the year 1539 or 40. Similar to many other Persian art signature inscriptions, the scholarly exploration of this text has been very limited. Some debate on the real identity and origins of Maqsood Kashani were almost the only discussions about the inscription, and as far as I know, there is no in-depth thematic exploration of the couplet in the context of Islamic shrine architecture. The text inscribed on such an important object that was perhaps commissioned by Shah Tahmasp's court and was meant to be used in the most politically strategic Safavid shrine was indeed selected with much care and was a deliberate, obsessive action. The thematics of the text refers to what a worshipper might say to the worshipped. The worshipper is the pilgrim or za'ir of the shrine, and the worshipped is God mediated by the saint entombed in the shrine. The application of the term astan leaves almost no doubt that the carpet was specifically woven for and used in a shrine, as astan or astane, which originally means threshold, in early modern mystical texts of Iran and also Ottomans refers to shrine. In a depiction of a typical Safavid shrine layout in a 1550 copy of Kulliyat Ahli Shirazi, the painting depicts an interior space of a shrine. Almost every element in the painting has an equivalent in the carpet. The lamps in different forms and sizes hung from the vaulted ceiling are very similar to the two exceptional lamps on the central axis of the carpet. There is also a magnificent carpet on the floor in the painting, which the pilgrims on its periphery can be seen. The many pilgrims in the painting are passionately engaged with their acts of pilgrimage, prayer, and devotion, while one of them bows close to the grille that marks the saint's tomb, with his head approaching the ground, representing the theme of the two couplets by Ahli on the top and bottom of the painting, which reads as بر آستانه قدرش ملک کم از خاک است چنان که قدر زمین بیش قدر افلاک است جهان عدم بود او را وجود می‌بینم و از آن وجود فلک در سجود می‌بینم. All the heavens worth less than dust in front of his realm, as the earth is more precious than the sky. The whole universe is nothing while he is everything. He, who the whole cosmos bows in front of him. The poem on the painting is thematically consistent with the carpet's inscription. Therefore, the representation of the pilgrim's actions in the shrine can be seen in the carpet through the inscription. In other words, it may be argued that the inscriptional text on the carpet represents what cannot be represented via the carpet medium, namely the devotional emotions of the pilgrims. The careful control of different visual and textual elements within the painting and the parallels between the painting and the carpet also shows that the choice of artistic design in both cases were well intended, and all the elements in the objects, including the text, referred to communal devotional acts and were meant to evoke certain emotions within the shrine space. While the Safavid historiography lacks enough survived writings on detailed aspects of such acts and what were held in such spaces and during the shrine visitations, the Ottoman sources give us some information in this regard. Although the context is different, it could well reflect common practices in the Safavid context as well. I refer to the 17th century traveler and writer Awliya Chalabi, who visited the shrine of Yahya Effendi in Beşiktaş. Chalabi describes that upon a summit of a tall hill close to the sea, within an exalted domed chamber, Qubbe, is the burial place of Yahya Effendi, a shrine, Astane, whose 4 walls has been covered by how many thousands of passionate lovers, or shaghan, able to write with all manners of couplets of poetry. Going back to what I started the paper with, making textual interventions on architecture has been a common practice, not only in our contemporary time, but also in the early modern period. Chalabi refers to the writing interventions on the walls of the shrine of Yahya Effendi by the lovers. If you visit the shrine today, you would be able to see the inscriptions in Arabic and Ottoman Turkish preserved in plexiglass. But where are these manifestations of love in the Persian Safavid architecture? While it's possible that similar practices existed at the same time in the Safavid context, it's also possible that they were more restricted and controlled, therefore have left no traces across the time. The Ottoman practices of wall writing were enabled by the use of white plaster, whereas Safavid architecture was intensely tile work based. Presumably, the interior space in the Sheikh Safi shrine, the shrine which might have been the place for the Ardabil carpet, or indeed the Royal Chapel Mosque of Lutfullah in Isfahan, has almost no single space for a wall writing. The extensive use of tile in the Timurid and especially Safavid interiors were indeed aesthetic functional architectural techniques. However, it might also be micropolitical strategies adopted by the patronage system to control what might and might not happen in the space. Although the space could be controlled through this strategy, the emotions engaged in the act of ziyarah and devotional practices were undeniable realities, and it can be imagined that the vibe and atmospheric qualities of such devotional places were considered by the patrons and artists who were in charge of designing elements for the shrine. In this case, And referring to Maqsood Kashani's carpet design, the inscription on the carpet should not be considered just a simple text. Rather, the text was carefully selected and was probably meant to realize a spatial and gestural action that in the reality is not possible. Although the shrines in Iran from the Timurid period onwards, and by the extensive use of tile in the interior space, perhaps partly as a political surveillance mechanism, restricted the pilgrims' integration into the building when encountering the devotional space, performing the act of ziyarah, and expressing their love, it could be argued that carpets, as artistic medium very interconnected with architecture and choreography of space, were used as methods of compensation for that lack of connection between the user and the shrine, or the character of the saint. The inscribed signature on the carpet, in fact, may show what is missing from the appearance of the relationship between the lover pilgrim and beloved saint. The signature on the carpet and any other objects, although as mentioned, carpet is particularly important in this discussion as it has a strong spatial, gestural, choreographic character. Carpets, apart from the historical, chronologic, and paleographic value, should be studied in terms of what it may reveal, the signature, the inscription, what it may reveal about the specific emotional relationship between the patron, artist, user, and the object. The object here is a medium that connects to a whole new sequence of association. In the case of the carpet and the signature inscription may be devices to realize what cannot be expressed, practiced, and performed by the user in the shrine space due to micropolitical logistical restrictions. The Iranian carpet artist in this context strategically uses the text for a performative expression of love. The content of the poem in the case of the Ardabil carpet is selected with care, as it is not a simple explanation of love, but a performative one that represents the very physical, gestural, choreographic act of a spatial devotion through the compression of the body, approaching the beloved, bowing, and even touching the ground with their head as a sign of love and full devotion. The whole couplet is an intense spatio-choreographic substantiation of love, and perhaps the type of love that we talked about across this paper, where such multi-layered set of elements are engaged with the act of encountering of one with an object, here a carpet. The curatorial strategies and even the description of the Ardabil carpet in the V&A pays little attention to this aspect and to the inscription. The complex, intimate relationship between a Muslim citizen and an art object, which is an important factor in understanding the Islamic art history, is an inner rather than outer quality, to understand which the attention must be paid to less explicit and more implicit portions of the artistic act. Referring to Baba Shah's Adab al-Mashq again, the effectivity of art is a result of the amalgamation of principles and purity. However, the contemporary practices of Islamic art exhibitions and museums is mainly based on explicit principles and neglect the implications and interpretations of what the inner qualities of art might convey. Although not included in the Ardabil carpet's inscription, but it can be imagined to be considered by the designer of the carpet, the last couplet of the same poem is an emphasis on the essentiality of the inner rather than outer beauty, where it says, خزینه دل حافظ به زلف و خال مده که کارهای چنین حد هر سپاهی نیست, which means, Hafiz, do not fall in love with beautiful hair and beauty marks. The precious land of the heart cannot be conquered by such weak armies. To conclude, curating objects for Islamic art museums and exhibitions, in order to decrease such ontological gaps between the museum or museological representations of Islamic art and the less tangible relationship between the patron, artist, user, and the art object, could enable a novel relationship between the observer of Islamic art and the object, This new perspective towards the curation of Islamic art may blur the boundaries between the art historical and ethnographic approach and set the value system of art, if any, not as grand, splendid historical objects that represent a dynasty, geography, or chronology, nor as objects abstracted into their function and applicability. Rather, it points to a third element of love, that is the result of the complex, intimate relationship between the patron, artist, user, and the object, and consequently between the observer of the art and the object. The Islamic art museums or exhibitions in this scenario will not be collections of glamorous artifacts, bombarding the observer with images and objects implying the fact that they should admire and love Islamic art merely because it's magnificent, a perspective promoted by Orientalists and even the contemporary no-Orientalists, perhaps in an unconscious manner. Rather, the whole experience of Islamic art must follow a reverse process through which the inner relationship, the love, and the intimate interpretive encounter between the observer and the object may result in the emergence of a consequential effect in the emotional systems of the observer, a similar feeling that might have emerged between Maqsood Kashani and the Ardabil carpet, also perhaps between an unknown pilgrim who visited the shrine and read the poem in the inscription in an emotional moment of encounter. The curation of Islamic art through this new criteria, however, is difficult, as the love embedded in this discourse, its taste, and its consequential effect are not easily measurable and are strongly hermeneutical and open to interpretation. While it makes the work more difficult and complicated, it shifts the whole practice of Islamic art exhibitions and the authority of the curators of Islamic art, and especially Persian art exhibitions, to a new level. This new paradigm also transforms the role of a museum goer from a mere spectator into an active part of the exhibition, an active part of the act of interpretation of art. Therefore, one single exhibition turns into infinite potential exhibitions, each with a novel set of intimate emotional encounters between the museum goer and the object. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moosavi. Such an amazing, innovating presentation, interdisciplinary overview of Islamic art exhibitions in the West and going to Persian literature and the function of literature in architecture and somehow applied art, and very brilliant conclusion. Thank you so much. Without any ado, I open the floor for questions and comments. My colleague is in here. Raise your hand, please, if you have any question or comments. We give you the microphone. Well, please, there is a question here. Can you raise your hand? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fascinating paper. I was interested when I was viewing the exhibit before coming to this talk this afternoon. One of the volunteers mentioned that for a lot of the pieces in this collection, they come without a history or without a genesis. They are collector's items. And I'm just wondering whether or not that adds an extra layer in terms of the way in which an exhibit is curated. If you are almost seeing objects in isolation with no past or no present, and how that impacts on how you interpret this kind of exhibition of Persian and Islamic art.
Is that something you want to answer?
Yes. I don't know which object my colleague in museum replied to. If you can be more precise, which object did you ask? we're talking about?
No, sorry, it wasn't one particular object. It's more just the case that if you have a look at where these pieces originated from or who they were donated by, my assumption, and this may be incorrect, is that in many instances the pieces, when they were made part of the collection, you may not have a context of where that came from or what the origin of that piece was. So not one piece individually, but more just sort of how the collection was gradually built up over the years in terms of what the Powerhouse has in its collection.
Yeah. The answer is complex because curator is different. I'm with the training of Islamic art history, but mostly I'm socio-cultural anthropologist. And the relationship between anthropologists and curatorial in the museum is different from art history and museum curatorial. Brings me to what's the definition between curating and the curatorial. These two things are entirely in the world of anthropology, especially cultural anthropology and museum, two distinctive things. Curating is just set up something, very briefly. The curatorial is something beyond set up something that goes, for example, the engagement of the visitors with the objects and collection. And back to your question, in this exhibition in Iran, very briefly, because this talk is not about the exhibition, the first questions I should say, please address to the topic of today, then we go to general questions about the exhibition for keep our time. Very briefly, what we have here is a selection of greater objects and collections, and the aim was beyond, the setup to come, as Dr. Moosavi mentioned, to see beautiful objects or high-rank elite objects, in matter of value in Islamic art. Mostly we wanted to invite you to think about the usage of objects within the culture, very briefly. But please try to focus on the questions regarding this specific paper, not about the exhibition.
Yes, I was very impressed by your talk, and particularly about how you interwove into it the idea of Persian poetry, which is something which seems to be also interwoven with the Islamic way of devotion and that sort of thing, right? The difficulty for a Western person is sort of that there are two levels, that we are two levels away from this poetry. One is the text itself, and then the script, which is so difficult to even contemplate what it may mean, right? For somebody who doesn't read Farsi or Arabic. Right? But other cultures have this relationship to poetry as well. And in German culture anyway, you have this big relationship with poetry, and particularly our great poet Goethe had studied Persian poetry and translated a lot of the poetry of Sani and Hafiz into German. And as a young man, I was very much taken by this. And living in Australia, I took it upon myself to translate Sani poems from German into English, which is sort of daft, right? But all this sort of comes back to me with your talk, and it is wonderful to hear what you have had to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Khasta Nabashi, thank you very much. That was fantastic. I just wanted to say, with regards to some of the critiques you were making about the Orientalist view, I think it also connects well in with this gentleman's conversation, in that it appears that I've been and seen some of those rooms. I've seen the Damascus room, you know, I've seen a lot of these things in the Pergamon or whatever. And you feel that the curators of, or the curatorial is missing, as this man said. It's trying to put something in behind a piece of glass or behind a rope that they can never fully understand. If you don't speak the language, you're never going to have the connection. Or if you're a curator in London and you've never been to this shrine, or you've never been to Sheikh al-Aqbala or whatever, you don't have the feeling that someone who is an observant of the religion, or someone who is passing through or sees this object every day, or makes decisions as to how they interact with the object or not, or the place, how can that be done? I mean, it's without people who are experts, or even people who have knowledge or customary knowledge, written knowledge, academic study, how can that circle ever be, you know, there's kind of one half of a circle where someone has the knowledge of how to put together an exhibition, but they're missing dele in mawzu'e nadarand, so nemi fahmand, so they don't understand the real depth or soul of this quandary. So yeah, that would be right.
Yes, that's right. And to add to what you said, so let's imagine someone who is curating an exhibition doesn't speak Persian, for example. That could be problematic, but I think the problem is not that a curator does not speak English, Persian, or cannot read Persian texts on an object. The problem is in the lack of attention to the text inscribed on objects. Even Persians, Persian poetry is so interconnected and interwoven with Iranian culture that when you look at an object in a museum, fully inscribed, it's just a very automatic process. You don't think about it at all. You just take it as something very straightforward, and that's it. So even you don't start to think about it, to think about the meaning, the content of the text. So I think the problem is not the lack of technicalities of understanding the text. It's about the lack of attention and knowing the centrality of the idea of text in Persian art.
So yeah, this context of how is an object used, it's not just, it doesn't exist in a vacuum by itself. It's surrounded by other things, or maybe it's connected to, as you say, when a decision is made to move a carpet away from a minbar or something like that, it's disconnecting what exists between a functional, whether it's an observational object or let's say an adornment of a place. If you take away the connection, the viewer is going to have, you know, they don't understand it already, but it's a very difficult thing to navigate. And I think if you have, I mean, as this lady said, I mean, her comment was, I felt valid, because when you have collections of things that are disparate, you might have a collection, 50 different things that have been donated from 100 different people or whatever it is. It's difficult when there's an extra thread that's missing. So whether it's geographic or locational or wherever it's from, and sometimes it's not known, but it also speaks to the kind of Orientalist collectionism or whatever, where someone's like, I've got this thing, it's from Persia, okay, here it is, and it's lost because obviously there's a deeper locale to that. Maybe it's from Kashan, maybe it's from Mashhad, maybe it's from Tabriz, and someone who understands or knows what it is or has the attention will know where it's from. But
Yes.
yeah, this
Yeah,
is a-
that's a fundamental question in the practices of museum. It's a very important question. Are we allowed at all to decontextualize objects from their original context or not? But it's a very, very vast question, and it affects the whole practice of museology. So, yes. Okay, I think the last question is.
Very last question.
I think as Australians we could all be greatly helped by reading Hafez and Rumi, and I think that I've been fascinated by the idea that these poems are read on many different levels, and I think that references the way we collect and show objects, that we must look on those different levels. We must be prepared to look on those different levels, because in our society we tend to have a very cut and dried view of what it's made of, when it was made, the maker, whereas you've shown us how much the poetry that is integral with your culture is so terribly important.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, it's a very valid, important point. One of the most important things that I try to convey throughout the paper.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moosavi. It was great. Just to, I know the question is very important, how we disconnect objects from culture and how we present in a museum. Just a small explanation. Iran Zamin is quite different, bring to your attention, because when you go outside, you have the catalog of the exhibition, and I invite you look at it again. And back to Iran Zamin. Iran Zamin divided into 7 different sets. Instead of looking at the object, we put the objects in the context of the culture, the usage, fabrication, patronage of the object. This is the differences, how anthropologists look at the object and how art historians look at the objects in the context of museum. So for those that are not familiar with entire Iran Zamin package program, every day in our cinema, constantly, we are presenting also 58-minute documentary films about the Qajar era, Nasruddin Shah, and his role in the patronage of Persian painting. So once again, thank you so much. And we will be present in Iran Zamin exhibition. If you have any questions or need a private tour. Thank you so much. Have a nice weekend. Thank you, Dr. Moosavi.